in the quiet village of Eldermere, where time seems to stand still, the past has a way of reaching into the present. Deep within the ruins of a forgotten temple, a young scholar named Kale stumbles upon something extraordinary, a cryptic map, its edges worn with age and its markings shimmering faintly, as if alive. For Kale, this isn't just any discovery. It's the first clue to a mystery that has haunted him for years, the unexplained disappearance of his family. What starts as a simple act of curiosity soon becomes a journey into the unknown, as the map leads him toward the legendary Enchanted Relics, artifacts whispered to hold power beyond imagination. But as Kale steps onto this path, he begins to sense that he's not alone. Whispers of shadowy figures and ancient curses trail behind him, hinting at dangers far greater than he could have ever imagined. The journey has only just begun, and the stakes are already higher than Kale realizes. What secrets do the Enchanted Relics hold, and what price will Kale have to pay to uncover the truth? The dense forest loomed ahead, its towering trees swallowed by a thick, swirling mist that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Kale stepped cautiously into the gloom, the air heavy with an unnatural hum that made his skin prickle. The map had led him here, but nothing could have prepared him for the eerie stillness that greeted him. Every step felt like an intrusion, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and from the shadows emerged a towering figure, a sentient tree spirit, its bark etched with ancient symbols and eyes glowing like embers. The spirit's voice echoed through the clearing, deep and resonant, demanding Kale prove his worth by unraveling a riddle tied to the forest's forgotten past. The riddle spoke of an ancient curse, a betrayal that had scarred the land, and a bond between the forest and its protectors. Kale's mind raced as he pieced together fragments of stories he'd read in his father's dusty tomes. The answer came to him in a flash, and as he spoke the final words, the spirit's eyes softened. It reached out a gnarled branch, and in its grasp was a glowing shard, a fragment of the first enchanted relic. The shard pulsed softly, its light seeping into Kale's hand, filling him with a warmth that felt both comforting and unsettling. The spirit's voice grew quiet, a warning lingering in the air. "Beware the shadows that follow you," it said. "They are drawn to the relic's power." As Kale stepped back into the mist, the forest seemed to exhale, the tension lifting slightly. But the spirit's warning lingered in his mind. He glanced over his shoulder, catching faint movements in the distance, shadowy figures, barely visible, trailing him like silent predators. The relic's glow flickered in his hand, and for the first time, he felt a strange pull within him, as if the shard had awakened something dormant. Could he control this power, or would it control him? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the forest faded behind him, and the path ahead grew darker still. The port town of Sea-Watch buzzed with life, its narrow streets teeming with sailors, merchants, and adventurers from distant lands. The salty tang of the sea mingled with the scent of spices and sweat, creating an atmosphere that was both chaotic and exhilarating. Kale moved through the crowd, his hood pulled low to avoid drawing attention. The map had led him here, to this sprawling hub of trade and secrets, where whispers of the next relic's location had surfaced. But navigating this labyrinth of alleys and markets was no simple task. Every corner seemed to hide a new challenge, and the shadowy figures trailing him were never far behind. It was in a dimly lit tavern, tucked away from the main thoroughfare, that Kale first crossed paths with Lyra. She was perched on a stool, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator. Her fingers danced lightly over a coin she just liberated from an unsuspecting patron, a small smirk playing on her lips. When Kale approached her, hoping for information, the tension between them was immediate. Lyra was wary, her instincts honed by years of survival in the underbelly of society. But when Kale revealed his quest for the Enchanted Relics, her demeanor shifted. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a shared understanding that went unspoken. She, too, had reasons for seeking the relics, reasons she wasn't ready to share. Their uneasy alliance began with a tense negotiation, each testing the other's limits. Lyra's knowledge of the town's hidden networks proved invaluable, and soon they found themselves descending into the depths of Sea-Watch's underground market. The air grew cooler, the noise of the town fading into a distant hum as they entered a cavernous chamber lit by flickering torches. The market was a maze of stalls and secret passages, where rare and forbidden items exchanged hands under the watchful eyes of shadowy figures. At its heart, atop a pedestal of black stone, lay a fragment of the second relic, a shard of crystal that pulsed faintly, its light reflecting off the faces of eager bidders. Kale and Lyra exchanged a glance, their plan forming in silence. They would need to act swiftly and decisively. Lyra's nimble fingers and quick thinking would be their greatest assets, but Kale's determination and knowledge of the relics would guide them. As the auctioneer raised the gavel, Lyra slipped into the crowd, her movements as fluid as water. Kale stayed close, his heart pounding as he watched her work. The moment the crystal was handed to the highest bidder, chaos erupted. Lyra's distraction, a carefully timed explosion of smoke, sent the crowd into a frenzy, and in the confusion, they seized the relic. But their victory was short-lived. As they fled through the winding tunnels, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them. A mercenary, his face obscured by a mask, emerged from the shadows, his blade gleaming in the torchlight. He moved with the precision of a hunter, his every step closing the distance between them. Kale's fear surged, a familiar weight that threatened to paralyze him. Failure wasn't an option, but trusting someone as unpredictable as Lyra was a risk he wasn't sure he could take. Yet as the mercenary closed in, Kale realized he had no choice. He would have to rely on her skills, her cunning, and her loyalty to their shared goal. Lyra's voice broke through his panic, sharp and commanding. "Follow me." She shouted, leading him through a hidden passage that even the mercenary couldn't anticipate. Their escape was a blur of twists and turns, the relic clutched tightly in Kale's hand. But even as they emerged into the cool night air, the danger lingered. The shadowy figures had made their move, and the mercenary was only the beginning. For Kale, the journey was no longer just about uncovering the relics. It was about learning to trust, to face his fears, and to embrace the unknown. And as he glanced at Lyra, her eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and defiance, he realized that perhaps he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. The sea stretched endlessly before them, its surface a churning mass of dark waves that seemed to rise and fall with a will of their own. The sky above had turned an ominous shade of gray, heavy clouds, swirling as if alive, crackling with bursts of lightning. Kale gripped the ship's railing, his knuckles white as the vessel pitched violently in the storm. The relics in his satchel pulsed faintly, their glow matching the rhythm of the tempest. It was no ordinary storm. This was something unnatural, something drawn to the relics. Lyra stood beside him, her face tense as she scanned the horizon. "This isn't just bad weather," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Something's out there." As if in response, the sea roared, and from the depths emerged a towering figure. The sea witch's form was a mix of beauty and terror, her hair a tangle of seaweed, her eyes glowing like the storm itself. Her voice echoed across the waves, commanding and cold. "You carry what does not belong to you," she hissed. "Give me the relics, and I will grant you safe passage. Refuse, and the sea will claim you." Kale's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "The relics aren't yours to take," he shouted back, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The witch's expression darkened, and with a wave of her hand, the storm intensified. The ship groaned under the strain, its timbers creaking as monstrous shapes began to emerge from the water. Tentacles, thick as tree trunks, lashed out, wrapping around the ship's hull. Sailors screamed as the creatures attacked, their cries swallowed by the storm. Kale felt a surge of panic, but then something strange happened. The relics in his satchel grew warm, their light flaring brighter. It was as if they were responding to his fear, to his desperation. Without thinking, he reached for them, and a burst of energy exploded from his hands, a blinding light that tore through the darkness. The creatures recoiled, their grip loosening as the light engulfed them. The storm faltered, the waves calming just enough for the ship to break free. But the power came at a cost. Kale staggered, his legs buckling as a wave of exhaustion washed over him. The relic's glow dimmed, and he slumped against the railing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lyra was at his side in an instant, her expression a mix of awe and concern. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Kale could only shake his head, his mind reeling. He had no answers, only the lingering sensation of the relic's power coursing through him, a power he wasn't sure he could control. The tension between them was palpable as the ship sailed on, the storm fading into the distance. Lyra's questions hung in the air, unanswered. Could Kale really handle the relic's power, or was he playing with forces far beyond his understanding? Her doubts mirrored his own, but there was no time to dwell on them. As the ship approached the next destination, a remote island shrouded in mist, they both knew the shadowy figures trailing them were closer than ever. The relics had saved them this time, but at what cost? And what awaited them on the island was anyone's guess. The journey was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The volcanic island rose from the ocean like a jagged crown, its peaks wreathed in plumes of smoke that stained the sky a dull, ashen gray. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur, and the ground beneath their feet felt unnervingly warm, as if the island itself was alive, breathing fire. Kale and Lyra exchanged a wary glance as they stepped onto the blackened shore, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. The third relic was said to lie deep within the island's heart, hidden in a labyrinth of molten caves where few dared to venture. But for Kale, the promise of answers, of a connection to his family, was worth any risk. The journey into the island's interior was a harrowing one. The caves twisted and turned, their walls glowing faintly with the heat of molten rock that flowed like rivers of fire. Every step was a gamble, the ground crumbling unpredictably, and the air growing hotter with each passing moment. Ancient puzzles, carved into the stone by long-forgotten hands, barred their way, forcing them to work together in ways they hadn't before. Kale's knowledge of the relics and their symbols proved invaluable, but it was Lyra's quick thinking and resourcefulness that often saved them from disaster. Yet, as they progressed, Lyra couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. Kale's growing reliance on the relic's power was becoming impossible to ignore. Each time he called upon their energy to solve a puzzle or clear a path, she noticed the way his hands trembled afterward, the way his eyes seemed to lose focus for a moment too long. The deeper they ventured, the more the relics seemed to respond to Kale's touch, their glow intensifying in his presence. It was as if they recognized him, as if they were awakening something within him. Lyra's concern grew with every flicker of light, every surge of power. She had seen what obsession with power could do, how it could consume a person from the inside out. "Kale," she said finally, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence of the caves. "You need to be careful. These relics, they're not just tools. They have a way of changing people." Kale turned to her, his expression a mix of frustration and determination. "I don't have a choice," he replied, "not if I want to find the truth about my family." At last, they reached the heart of the labyrinth, a cavern bathed in an eerie, golden light. Suspended in the air, as if held by an invisible force, was the third relic, a circlet of intertwined metal and stone, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed rhythmically. Kale stepped forward, his hand outstretched, and as his fingers closed around the circlet, the cavern seemed to come alive. A blinding flash of light engulfed him, and suddenly, he was no longer in the cave. He stood in a sunlit field, the air filled with the sound of laughter. His family was there, his parents smiling at him, their faces filled with warmth and pride. But as quickly as the vision came, it faded, leaving Kale gasping for breath, the circlet clutched tightly in his hand. Lyra was at his side in an instant, her hands gripping his shoulders. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp with worry. Kale's eyes were distant, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw them, my family. They were here in this place. The relics, they're connected to them somehow." Lyra's expression hardened. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," she said. "You're getting too close to this, Kale. Whatever the relics are, whatever they're tied to, it's dangerous. You can't let it consume you." Kale looked at her, his resolve unwavering. "I have to know the truth," he said simply. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of footsteps echoing through the cavern. The mercenary and his forces had found them, their weapons drawn and their faces set in grim determination. The ambush was swift and brutal, forcing Kale and Lyra to fight for their lives. The relic's power surged within Kale as he defended himself, but this time it felt different, more volatile, harder to control. Lyra fought beside him, her movements precise and deadly, but her eyes kept darting to Kale, her worry growing with every burst of energy he unleashed. By the time they escaped the cavern, the island was trembling beneath their feet, the volcano threatening to erupt. They barely made it to their ship, the relic in hand, but the cost weighing heavily on them both. As they sailed away from the island, the volcano's fiery peak fading into the distance, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The relics were changing Kale, and she wasn't sure he even realized it. The shadowy figures pursuing them were growing bolder, their attacks more calculated. And now, with 3 relics in their possession, the stakes had never been higher. Kale stood at the ship's bow, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind undoubtedly replaying the vision of his family. But Lyra's thoughts were elsewhere. She knew the journey ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, and she only hoped Kale would be strong enough to resist the pull of the relic's power. For now, all they could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, into the unknown. The village of Thorn Hollow was a quiet haven, nestled in the shadow of jagged cliffs. Its cobblestone streets lined with weathered cottages, and the faint scent of herbs wafting from open windows. Kael and Lyra stumbled into the village under the cover of night, their bodies battered and their spirits worn thin. The ambush on the volcanic island had left its mark. Kale bore a deep gash across his arm, while Lyra's side was bruised and tender. The villagers, wary of strangers but kind-hearted, offered them shelter in a small, dimly lit inn. As they tended to their wounds, Kale couldn't shake the weight of the relics in his satchel. They pulsed faintly, a constant reminder of the power they held and the danger that came with it. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the inn's dusty windows, an elderly woman approached them. Her name was Melees, the village storyteller and keeper of its oldest secrets. She moved with a quiet grace, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You carry the relics," she said softly, her gaze lingering on Kale. It wasn't a question. She beckoned them to follow her to a secluded garden at the edge of the village, where a weathered stone fountain stood, its waters still and undisturbed. There, Melees began to speak of a prophecy, a tale as old as the relics themselves. Long ago, she began, her voice low and melodic. The relics were created not as tools of power, but as safeguards. They were meant to protect the world from a cataclysm born of greed and ambition. But those who sought to wield them for selfish gain brought ruin instead. The relics were scattered, hidden away to prevent their misuse. Yet the prophecy warns that if they are brought together again without wisdom, the cataclysm will return, more terrible than before. Kale listened in silence, his chest tightening with each word. The relics weren't just a key to his family's past. They were a burden, a responsibility he hadn't fully understood. Lyra, however, seemed unfazed. Her eyes gleamed with a calculating light as she leaned forward. "If the relics hold that much power," she said, her tone casual but probing, "then surely they could be used to prevent this cataclysm, not cause it. Or even to achieve something greater." Melees shook her head, her expression grave. "The relics are not meant to be controlled. They are a test, a trial for those who seek them. Misuse them, and the consequences will be dire." Kale felt a chill run down his spine. He had always believed the relics were a means to an end, a way to uncover the truth about his family. But now, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that they might be something far more dangerous. As the days passed, the tension between Kael and Lyra grew palpable. Kale found himself questioning his mission, his mind clouded with doubts. Was he destined to save the world, or was he unknowingly paving the way for its destruction? Lyra, on the other hand, remained focused on the relic's potential, her motivations clear and unwavering. "You're overthinking this," she said one evening, her voice edged with frustration. "We have the power to change everything. Why let fear hold us back?" Kale hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's not fear," he replied. "It's responsibility. If we're wrong, the cost is too high." Their differing priorities created a rift, each conversation leaving them further apart. Kale began to wonder if he could trust Lyra at all. Her self-serving motives clashed with his growing sense of duty, and he found himself torn between continuing the journey alone or risking the unpredictability of their partnership. The relic's glow seemed to mock him, their light a constant reminder of the power and the peril they represented. Just as they were preparing to leave Thorn Hollow, a traveler arrived with news that sent a ripple of unease through the village. A fourth relic had been sighted in the sands of the Cursed Desert, a vast wasteland said to be haunted by the spirits of those who had perished seeking its secrets. The traveler's description was vivid. The relic was a staff, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly even in the harsh sunlight. But the warning was clear. The desert was no ordinary place. It was a land of illusions and treachery, where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. Kael and Lyra stood at the edge of the village, the weight of their next decision heavy in the air. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and moral dilemmas. Kale glanced at Lyra, her expression unreadable as she stared into the distance. He knew they couldn't turn back now, but the question lingered. Could they move forward together, or would their differences tear them apart? The relics had brought them this far, but the path ahead would test not just their skills, but their very souls. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The Cursed Desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of shifting sands that shimmered under the relentless sun. The air was dry and scorching, each breath a struggle as Kale and Lyra pressed forward, their footsteps swallowed by the dunes. The desert was unlike anything they had faced before, a place where reality twisted and bent, where the line between truth and illusion blurred. The relics in Kale's satchel pulsed faintly, their glow a constant reminder of the power they carried. But here, in this desolate wasteland, that power felt heavier, more volatile, as if the desert itself was alive and watching. The first mirage came without warning. One moment, Kale was trudging through the sand, and the next, he stood in a sunlit meadow, the air filled with the sound of laughter. His family was there, his parents smiling at him, their faces radiant with warmth and pride. But something was wrong. Their smiles turned to grimaces, their eyes filled with sorrow as they reached out to him, their voices pleading. "Why didn't you save us?" they whispered, their words cutting deeper than any blade. Kale stumbled back, his heart pounding, but the vision lingered, refusing to fade. It wasn't just a memory, it was a question, a guilt he had buried for years. Why hadn't he been there? Why had he survived when they hadn't? Lyra, too, was caught in the desert's illusions. She stood in a shadowy alley, the air thick with the scent of rain and blood. A figure stepped out of the darkness, someone she had once trusted, someone she had called family. Their betrayal was fresh, their face a mask of cold indifference as they turned their back on her, leaving her alone in the rain. The pain of that moment was raw, unrelenting, and for the first time, Lyra's hardened exterior cracked. She clenched her fists, her jaw tight, but the vision wouldn't let go. The desert was a mirror, reflecting their deepest fears and regrets, forcing them to confront what they had tried so hard to forget. As they pushed through the illusions, the truth began to unravel. Kale's visions grew clearer, revealing fragments of a past he had never known. His family hadn't just been scholars or adventurers, they had been guardians of the relics, tasked with protecting them from those who would misuse their power. But their trust had been their downfall. Someone close to them, someone they had believed in, had betrayed them, leading to their disappearance. The realization hit Kale like a blow, leaving him reeling. The relics weren't just a means to uncover the truth. They were his inheritance, his burden to bear. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time, he wondered if he was strong enough to carry it. Lyra's visions, too, hinted at secrets she had kept hidden. The betrayal she had endured wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a scar that had shaped her, driving her to rely on no one but herself. Yet as she walked beside Kale, her resolve wavered. The desert had a way of stripping away pretense, of forcing honesty where there had only been silence. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but the walls she had built were beginning to crack. The question lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. Could they trust each other, or would their pasts tear them apart? When they finally reached the relic, it stood at the heart of a vast, crumbling temple, its walls etched with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The relic itself was a staff, its surface glowing with an eerie, golden light, but it wasn't unguarded. A sand wraith emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and twisting as if made of the desert itself. Its eyes burned with a cold, malevolent light, and its voice was a whisper that echoed in their minds. "Guilt is a heavy burden," it hissed. "Let me relieve you of it." The wraith lunged, its claws slashing through the air, and Kale barely had time to react. He reached for the relics, their power surging through him as he called upon their energy to fight back. The wraith recoiled, its form flickering as the relic's light enveloped it, but the battle was far from easy. The wraith fed on their guilt, their pain, growing stronger with every doubt and regret it dredged up. Kale's vision blurred, his strength faltering as the relic's power drained him. He could feel their influence growing, their pull becoming harder to resist. Yet he fought on, driven by a determination that went beyond logic or reason. With a final burst of energy, he struck the wraith down, its form dissolving into a cloud of sand that scattered in the wind. The victory came at a cost. Kale collapsed to his knees, his body trembling as the relic's glow dimmed. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, he felt as if the desert itself was closing in around him. Lyra was at his side in an instant, her hands gripping his shoulders. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said, her voice sharp with concern. Kale could only nod, his mind reeling. The relic's power had saved them, but each use left him more vulnerable, more susceptible to their influence. He could feel them whispering to him, their voices faint but insistent, and he knew he couldn't ignore them for much longer. As they left the temple, the staff clutched tightly in Kale's hand. The desert seemed to shift around them. The mirages faded, the air growing cooler as the sun dipped below the horizon. But the journey was far from over. The revelations of the desert had changed them, forcing them to confront truths they had buried deep. Kale's vision of his family had grown clearer, but the weight of their legacy was heavier than ever. Lyra's past had come to the surface, her walls beginning to crumble under the weight of honesty, and as they walked into the gathering darkness, the relic's glow flickered faintly, a reminder of the power and the peril they carried. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the worst was yet to come. The bustling city of Ardentes was a stark contrast to the desolate sands of the cursed desert. Its towering spires and crowded streets were alive with activity, yet as Kael and Lyra stepped through its gates, they were met with an unsettling tension. The air was thick with whispers, and the faces of the townsfolk were drawn with fear. Posters plastered on every wall bore their likenesses, branded beneath bold letters, "Wanted." The relics they carried were no longer just a mystery. They had become a symbol of destruction, blamed for the chaos that had begun to spread across the land. The shadowy figures they had been evading had not only caught up to them, but had turned the world against them. Kale's heart sank as he read the accusations. Entire villages had been decimated, the handiwork of those who sought to frame him and Lyra. The relics, once a source of hope, were now seen as harbingers of doom. He felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him, each step forward seeming to bring more unintended consequences. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered, his voice heavy with regret. "We were supposed to uncover the truth, not bring ruin." Lyra, however, had a different perspective. Her sharp eyes scanned the crowd, her mind already calculating. "This chaos," she said, her tone low and deliberate, "isn't just a problem, it's an opportunity. People are scared, desperate. That makes them predictable. We can use this to our advantage." Kale turned to her, his brows furrowed. "Use it, Lyra. Innocent people are suffering because of us. We can't just exploit that." Her gaze hardened, a flicker of frustration crossing her features. "We didn't start this, Kale, but if we don't play the game, we'll lose. You can't save everyone by being noble." Their disagreement simmered as they moved through the city, sticking to the shadows to avoid detection. The tension between them grew with every step, their conflicting approaches driving a wedge deeper into their partnership. Kale's guilt gnawed at him, while Lyra's pragmatism only fueled her determination. The relics in his satchel seemed to pulse in time with his racing thoughts, their glow a constant reminder of the power and the peril they carried. For the first time, he questioned whether he could continue. The cost was too high, the burden too great. Maybe it was time to let go, to walk away before more lives were lost. That night, as they took shelter in an abandoned chapel, Kale found himself alone with his thoughts. The flickering light of a single candle cast long shadows on the worn stone walls, and the silence was heavy with unspoken doubts. He sat on the cold floor, the relics resting in his lap, their glow faint but insistent. Closing his eyes, he let out a slow breath, his mind drifting. And then it happened. A vision, clearer and more vivid than any before. He stood in a familiar room, the scent of old books and candle wax filling the air. His family was there, their faces filled with urgency. Kale, his father's voice echoed, firm but gentle. You cannot stop now. The relics are not just tools, they are a warning. A greater threat is coming, one that will consume everything if you falter. His mother reached out, her hand brushing his cheek. You are stronger than you know. Trust in the path you've chosen. The vision faded, leaving Kale breathless and shaken. The weight of his family's words settled over him, their urgency cutting through his doubts. He wasn't just searching for answers anymore. He was fighting for something far greater. The shadowy figures, the chaos they had unleashed, the relic's growing power. It was all connected, part of a much larger tapestry he had only begun to unravel. He couldn't turn back now. The stakes were too high. When Lyra found him, her expression was unreadable. You look like you've seen a ghost, she remarked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Kale met her gaze, his resolve steady. We need to keep moving, he said simply. There's something bigger at play here, and we're the only ones who can stop it. Lyra raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smirk playing on her lips. Finally catching up, are we? She teased, but there was a flicker of relief in her voice. The tension between them eased, if only slightly, as they prepared to leave the chapel. As they slipped into the night, the city's lights fading behind them, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The shadowy figures were closing in, their motives still shrouded in mystery. The relic's power was growing harder to control, their whispers growing louder with each passing day. And yet, despite the chaos and the danger, Kale felt a strange sense of clarity. He had chosen this path, and he would see it through not just for himself, but for the world his family had tried to protect. The journey ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but one thing was certain, they couldn't afford to fail. The crumbling fortress loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette cutting through the stormy sky like the broken teeth of some long-forgotten beast. Rain lashed against the ancient stones, the wind howling as if warning them to turn back. But Kale and Lyra pressed on, the relics in their satchel pulsing faintly, their glow a beacon guiding them forward. The fortress was said to be home to a reclusive scholar, a man who had spent decades unraveling the mysteries of the relics. If anyone could shed light on their true purpose, it was him. Yet as they approached the heavy iron gates, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far darker than they anticipated. Inside, the fortress was a labyrinth of shadowed corridors and crumbling chambers, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The scholar, a gaunt man with piercing eyes and a voice like gravel, greeted them with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. His name was Aldrich, and his knowledge of the relics was unparalleled. As he led them deeper into the fortress, his words painted a picture Kale had never imagined. The relics, Aldrich explained, were not merely tools of power. They were keys created by an ancient civilization to seal away an unimaginable evil, a force so destructive it had nearly consumed the world. Kale's chest tightened as the scholar spoke, his mind racing. The relics were a safeguard, a last line of defense against a threat that had been buried for centuries. But there was more. Aldrich's voice grew quieter, his tone almost reverent as he revealed the relic's other potential. They were designed to contain the evil, he said, but in the right hands they could also control it. The implication hung heavy in the air, and Kale felt a chill run down his spine. If the relics could control this ancient evil, what would stop someone from using them for their own gain? The thought was terrifying, yet also tantalizing. Lyra's reaction was immediate. Her eyes gleamed with a calculating light, her mind already weaving possibilities. "Control it," she repeated, her voice casual but laced with interest. "That changes things, doesn't it?" Kale shot her a wary glance, sensing the shift in her tone. For him, the relics had always been a means to uncover the truth about his family. But now, faced with the weight of their true purpose, he felt torn. Could he justify using them for personal reasons when the fate of the world hung in the balance? The question gnawed at him, leaving him more uncertain than ever. As the hours passed, Kale and Lyra's differing priorities became impossible to ignore. Kale spent his time poring over Aldrich's ancient texts, searching for any clue that might connect the relics to his family. Lyra, on the other hand, began to ask pointed questions, her curiosity veering into something more ambitious. She wanted to know how the relics could be used, what it would take to harness their full potential. Aldrich, sensing her intent, grew wary, his warnings sharp and urgent. "The relics are not a weapon," he insisted. "To wield them for control is to invite catastrophe. The line between sealing and unleashing is perilously thin." But Lyra wasn't easily dissuaded. Her fascination with the relic's power had taken root, and Kale could see the wheels turning in her mind. She began to distance herself from him, her movements deliberate, her conversations clipped. The trust between them, already fragile, began to fray. Kale tried to confront her, to voice his concerns, but she brushed him off, her tone dismissive. "We're not here to play hero," she said. "If the relics can give us an edge, we'd be fools not to use it." Her words left him uneasy, a growing sense of dread settling in his chest. Their fragile alliance was tested sooner than either of them expected. The shadowy figures, relentless as ever, stormed the fortress under the cover of darkness. The attack was swift and brutal, the air filled with the clash of steel and the crackle of magic. Kale and Lyra fought side by side, their movements synchronized out of necessity rather than trust. The relic's power surged through Kale as he defended himself, their energy a double-edged sword that both protected and drained him. Lyra, ever resourceful, used the chaos to her advantage, her agility and cunning keeping them alive. But as the battle raged on, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting not just their enemies, but each other. In the chaos, Aldrich fell. A blade meant for Kale found its mark in the scholar's chest, his life slipping away before their eyes. With his final breath, he whispered a warning, his voice barely audible over the din. "The relics, they are a test. Choose wisely." His words lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the stakes they faced. Kale felt a surge of grief and guilt, his hands trembling as he clutched the relics. They had come here for answers, but all they had found were more questions. As the shadowy figures retreated, the fortress fell silent, the weight of their loss pressing heavily on Kale and Lyra. The scholar's death had left them with no clear path forward, only the relics and the growing chasm between them. Kale's resolve wavered, his mind clouded with doubt. Could he trust Lyra, or had her ambition blinded her to the dangers they faced? The relic's glow flickered faintly in his hands, their power both a comfort and a curse. The journey had never been easy, but now, more than ever, Kale realized that the hardest choices were still ahead, and as the storm raged on outside the fortress walls, he couldn't help but wonder if they were already too late to stop what was coming. The floating city of Aetheris was a legend whispered in taverns and scribbled in the margins of ancient maps, a place said to exist beyond the clouds, untouched by time and decay. For Kael and Lyra, it was more than a myth. It was their next destination. The sixth relic, hidden within its soaring spires, was the key to unraveling the final threads of the mystery that bound them. But reaching Aetheris was no simple feat. The city floated high above the earth, accessible only by airship, and the skies were a treacherous expanse, patrolled by sky pirates and plagued by storms. Their only hope was a smuggler's vessel, a rickety contraption held together by rust and desperation, captained by a grizzled rogue named Jerk. Jerk's ship, the Wind Rider, was a far cry from the sleek airships of legend. Its hull groaned under the strain of the wind, and its sails were patched with scraps of cloth. But Jerk was a man of his word, and the promise of gold had convinced him to take the risk. As the ship ascended into the clouds, Kale felt a strange mix of awe and unease. The world below faded into a sea of white, the air growing thin and cold. The relics in his satchel pulsed faintly, their glow a constant reminder of the power they carried. Lyra, ever vigilant, kept her distance, her eyes darting between the horizon and Kale. The tension between them was palpable, a silent divide that had only grown since the fortress. The journey was anything but smooth. The skies were a battlefield, the air thick with the roar of engines and the crackle of lightning. Sky pirates, drawn by the relic's energy, attacked with ruthless precision. Their ships were sleek and deadly, their cannons firing bursts of fire that illuminated the clouds. Kale and Lyra fought side by side, their movements sharp and desperate. But as the battle raged on, Kale felt something shift within him. The relic's power surged through his veins, a torrent of energy that made his skin tingle and his heart race. He called upon it instinctively, his hands glowing with an otherworldly light as he unleashed a wave of energy that sent the pirates' ships spiraling into the void. The victory came at a cost. Kale stumbled, his breath ragged as the relic's power receded, but something was different this time. His eyes, once a familiar shade of brown, now glowed faintly, their light a mirror of the relic's energy. His strength, too, felt unnatural, his movements faster and more precise than they should have been. Lyra noticed the change immediately, her expression a mix of concern and suspicion. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said, her voice sharp. "You're not the same as you were before, Kale. I can see it." He tried to brush off her words, but the truth was undeniable. The relics were changing him, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. When the Wind Rider finally broke through the clouds, Aetheris came into view, a breathtaking sight of gleaming towers and cascading waterfalls suspended in midair. But as they drew closer, the city's true state became clear. Its spires were cracked and crumbling, its streets silent and empty. The once majestic city was a shadow of its former self, its beauty marred by decay and neglect. Kale and Lyra stepped onto its streets with a sense of foreboding, the relic's glow flickering faintly in the dim light. The air was thick with the scent of rust and ash, and the only sound was the distant hum of machinery. At the heart of the city, they found the relic, a crystalline orb resting atop a pedestal of black stone, but it wasn't unguarded. A mechanical titan, its body a patchwork of gears and wires, stood watch over the relic, its glowing eyes fixed on Kale. The titan moved with a deliberate slowness, its voice a deep, metallic rumble as it spoke. "You carry the relics," it said, its tone almost reverent. "But do you understand their purpose?" Kale hesitated, his mind racing. The titan's question struck a chord, forcing him to confront the doubts that had been gnawing at him. The relics weren't just tools or keys. They were a responsibility, a test of his ability to wield their power without losing himself. The titan's attack was swift and brutal, its massive fists slamming into the ground with enough force to crack the stone. Kael and Lyra fought with everything they had, their movements a blur of desperation and determination. But the titan was relentless, its strength unmatched. Kale felt the relic's power surge within him once more, their energy coursing through his veins as he unleashed a blast of light that sent the titan stumbling. The effort left him gasping, his body trembling as the relic's glow intensified. He could feel their influence growing, their whispers growing louder in his mind. The line between control and surrender was growing thinner, and Kale wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. As the titan fell, its body collapsing into a heap of broken gears, Kale stood over it, his breath ragged and his eyes glowing faintly. Lyra watched him warily, her expression unreadable. The tension between them was thicker than ever, a silent divide that threatened to tear them apart. Kale knew the journey was far from over, but the path ahead was darker than ever. The relics were changing him, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Could he trust himself, or was he walking a path that would lead to his own destruction? As the ruins of Aetheris loomed around them, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The mechanical titan loomed over Kale and Lyra, its towering frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the crumbling remnants of Aetheris. Its glowing eyes locked onto Kale, and for a moment, the air grew still, charged with an unspoken tension. Then, with a deafening roar, the titan surged forward, its massive fists slamming into the ground with enough force to send cracks rippling through the stone beneath their feet. Kale barely had time to react, diving to the side as debris rained down around him. Lyra was already moving, her agility and precision keeping her just out of reach of the titan's sweeping attacks. But this was no ordinary fight. The titan wasn't just a mindless machine. It was a guardian, and it had a message to deliver. As Kale scrambled to his feet, the relics in his satchel pulsed with an intensity he had never felt before. Their energy surged through him, a rush of warmth that made his skin tingle and his vision blur. He felt a strange pull, as if the relics were trying to tell him something. And then, suddenly, the titan stopped. Its glowing eyes dimmed slightly, and its voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the ruins. "Kale," it said, the name ringing with an eerie familiarity. You carry the relics, but do you understand their purpose? Kale froze, his breath catching in his throat. The Titan's voice wasn't just mechanical, it carried an ancient weight, a tone that spoke of centuries of knowledge and purpose. Your ancestors created me, it continued, its words slow and deliberate. I was forged to protect the relics, to ensure they could never be misused. But the time has come for you to make a choice. Kale's mind raced as the Titan spoke, its words cutting through the chaos of the battle. The relics weren't just tools or keys. They were a safeguard, created to seal away an ancient evil that threatened to consume the world. But the final relic, the one hidden within Aetheris, was different. It was the key, the one piece that could either lock the evil away forever or unleash it upon the world. The revelation hit Kale like a punch to the gut. The relics had always been tied to his family's disappearance, but now he realized the stakes were far greater. He had spent his entire journey searching for answers, driven by the hope of finding his family. But now, faced with the truth, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The Titan's words lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the choice he had to make. Destroy the relics, and the evil would remain sealed, but he might never uncover the truth about his family. Use them, and he risked unleashing a force that could destroy everything. Lyra, ever perceptive, noticed the shift in Kale's demeanor. She stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "This is our chance," she said, her eyes gleaming with a mix of ambition and desperation. "We've come this far. If the relics can give us the power to change things, why not use it? You could find your family, Kale. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" Her words were persuasive, laced with a logic that was hard to ignore. But there was something in her tone, a hint of something darker, that made Kale hesitate. He turned to her, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Lyra had been his ally, his partner in this journey, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were diverging. Her desire for power, her willingness to take risks, was at odds with his growing sense of responsibility. The Titan's warning echoed in his mind, a stark contrast to Lyra's reasoning. "The relics are not a weapon," the Titan had said. "To wield them for control is to invite catastrophe." Kale felt the weight of those words, the truth behind them settling heavily on his shoulders. The tension between them was palpable, a silent divide that threatened to shatter their fragile partnership. Lyra's gaze was steady, her expression unreadable, but Kale could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted the relic's power, and she wasn't afraid to use it. But Kale couldn't ignore the warnings, the growing sense that the path she wanted to take would lead to disaster. The choice was his, and it wasn't just about the relics. It was about who he could trust. Lyra, with her ambition and cunning, or the Titan, with its ancient wisdom and warnings of doom. As the storm clouds gathered overhead, Kale stood at a crossroads, the relic's glow flickering faintly in his hands. The journey had brought him here, to the heart of Aetheris, but the real battle was just beginning. The relics weren't just a means to an end, they were a test, a trial of his ability to wield their power without losing himself. And as he looked at Lyra, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and determination, he realized that the hardest choice wasn't just about the relics, it was about who he was willing to become. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the stakes had never been higher. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and earth as Kael and Lyra stood at the edge of a crumbling path, the wind tugging at their cloaks. The tension between them had reached its breaking point, their once shared goal now pulling them in opposite directions. Lyra's gaze was steely, her jaw set with determination. "This is where we part ways," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm going after the shadowy figures. If they're behind all this chaos, maybe I can cut a deal, turn the tables before they turn on us." Kale nodded, though his chest tightened at the thought. He knew her well enough to understand that her motives were as much about survival as they were about ambition. But his path lay elsewhere, toward the final relic hidden in a valley, cloaked in eternal twilight. As Lyra disappeared into the shadows, Kale turned his attention to the horizon, where the first hints of twilight shimmered in the distance. The journey to the valley was unlike any he had undertaken before. The land seemed to shift and fold around him, as if the very earth conspired to keep its secrets hidden. The relics in his satchel pulsed faintly, their glow a constant reminder of the power they held, and the choices he would soon have to make. When he finally reached the valley, the sight took his breath away. The sky above was a tapestry of deep purples and golds, the sun forever caught in the moment before setting. The air was still, almost reverent, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. It wasn't long before the spirits appeared. At first, they were little more than flickers of light, dancing at the edges of his vision. But as Kale ventured deeper into the valley, the spirits took on more distinct forms. They were his ancestors, their faces achingly familiar, their eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. One spirit stepped forward, his features so like Kale's father's that it made his heart ache. "You've come far, Kale," the spirit said, his voice echoing with a timbre that was both comforting and haunting. "But there is still much you do not understand." The spirits revealed the truth in fragments, their words painting a picture that left Kale reeling. His family hadn't simply disappeared, they had sacrificed themselves to protect the relics, binding their very souls to the artifacts. The relics weren't just tools or keys, they were a prison, a barrier holding back an ancient evil that threatened to consume the world. To free his family, Kale would have to destroy the relics, but doing so would shatter that barrier, leaving the world vulnerable to the darkness his ancestors had fought so hard to contain. The revelation struck like a blow, leaving Kale gasping for breath as the weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders. The spirits' faces were filled with compassion, but their words offered no comfort. "The choice is yours, Kale," his father's spirit said, his voice soft but unwavering. "You can free us, but at what cost? Or you can keep the relics intact, knowing that our sacrifice will not be in vain." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Kale felt as though the ground beneath him had vanished, leaving him suspended between two impossible choices. To destroy the relics would mean losing the last connection to his family, but to preserve them would mean condemning his ancestors' souls to an eternity of bondage. The thought of either outcome was unbearable. As the spirits faded back into the twilight, Kale sank to his knees, his hands trembling as he clutched the relics. Their glow pulsed faintly, as if echoing the turmoil in his heart. For the first time in his journey, he felt truly alone. The relics had always been a source of hope, a way to uncover the truth about his family. But now, Faced with the reality of their purpose, he felt the weight of their power like a chain around his neck. The world depended on his choice, and yet, how could he bear to make it? The valley seemed to close in around him, the eternal twilight casting long shadows that mirrored the darkness in his thoughts. Kale sat in silence, the relics cradled in his hands, their glow a faint reminder of the light he might have to extinguish. The journey had brought him here, to this moment of reckoning, but the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. Whatever he chose, the consequences would ripple far beyond himself, shaping the fate of the world and the legacy of his family. And as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Kale realized that the hardest part of his journey was only just beginning. The final relic lay at the heart of the valley, its presence a faint hum that seemed to resonate with the very air around it. Kale approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The twilight sky above cast an otherworldly glow, illuminating the relic, a delicate, ancient amulet suspended in midair, its surface etched with symbols that pulse faintly with a golden light. But as he reached out to take it, the ground beneath him trembled, and a figure materialized before him. It was neither human nor spirit, but something in between, an entity of pure energy, its form shifting and shimmering like a living flame. Its voice was a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through Kale's bones. "You seek the relic," it said, its tone neither kind nor cruel. "But are you prepared to face what it demands of you?" Before Kale could respond, the entity's form expanded, enveloping him in a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Suddenly, he was no longer in the valley. He stood in a familiar room, the scent of old books and candle wax filling his senses. His family was there, his parents, his younger sister, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The scene unfolded before him like a memory he had buried deep, one he had never allowed himself to fully confront. His father's voice was steady, but laced with urgency as he spoke. "Kale, you must leave. Take the relics and go. We'll hold them off as long as we can." His mother's eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was firm. "This is the only way. You have to survive." Kale's heart clenched as he watched the memory play out, helpless to intervene. The shadowy figures burst into the room, their forms dark and indistinct, their movements swift and merciless. His parents fought valiantly, but the odds were against them. His sister, barely a child, clung to him, her small hands trembling. "Kale, run," she pleaded, her voice breaking. And then, in a flash of light and chaos, they were gone. The room dissolved into darkness, leaving Kale alone, his chest heaving with grief and rage. The entity's voice echoed around him, cold and unyielding. "This is the price of the relic. Can you bear it?" Kale's knees buckled under the weight of the memory, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The pain was unbearable, a raw, searing wound that threatened to consume him. But as the grief threatened to overwhelm him, something shifted. Amid the darkness, fragments of other memories surfaced, moments of laughter, of warmth, of love. His father teaching him to read ancient texts, his mother humming softly as she worked, his sister's infectious giggles filling the room. These were the moments that had defined his family, that had shaped him. They were more than their final sacrifice. They were a legacy of love and strength. And in that realization, Kale found the resolve to stand. He rose to his feet, his eyes blazing with determination. "I can bear it," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. The entity regarded him for a moment, its form flickering as if in acknowledgement. Then, with a wave of its hand, it released the amulet, allowing it to drift into Kale's waiting grasp. The moment his fingers closed around it, a surge of energy coursed through him, and the ground beneath him shook violently. The air grew heavy, charged with an oppressive force that seemed to press in from all sides. The entity's voice echoed one last time, a warning that sent a chill down Kale's spine. The barrier weakens, the ancient evil stirs. You must act swiftly, or all will be lost. Kale's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. The relics, now gathered in their entirety, pulsed with a light that was both beautiful and terrifying. Their power was immense, but so too was the danger they held. The ancient evil, imprisoned for centuries, was beginning to break free, and the world stood on the brink of catastrophe. He had no time to grieve, no time to hesitate. The journey had brought him here, to this moment of reckoning, and the choice he made next would shape the fate of everything he held dear. Clutching the amulet tightly, Kale turned and ran, the valley's twilight fading behind him as he raced against time. The relic's glow flickered faintly in his satchel, a reminder of the power he carried and the responsibility that came with it. The road ahead was uncertain, the stakes higher than ever, but one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. The ancient evil had awakened, and Kale was the only one who could stop it. The question that lingered, unspoken but undeniable, was whether he could do so without losing himself in the process. The cold wind howled across the desolate plains as Kale trudged forward, the relic's weight heavy in his satchel. The journey had taken its toll, his body weary, but his spirit unyielding. He had no time to rest. The barrier was weakening, and the ancient evil's presence loomed like a storm on the horizon. But as he crested a hill, a familiar figure stood in his path. Lyra, her stance was confident, her eyes sharp and calculating, but there was something different about her now. A coldness had settled in her gaze, a hardness that hadn't been there before. Behind her, the shadowy figures lingered, their forms shifting like smoke in the fading light. "You've been busy," Lyra said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "But you're going about this all wrong, Kale. The relics aren't meant to be destroyed. They're meant to be used." She stepped closer, her tone softening, almost pleading. "Think about it. With their power, we could change everything, end wars, heal the land, make the world what it should be. Don't you see, this is our chance to fix what's broken." Her words were persuasive, laced with a logic that was hard to ignore, but Kale could see the ambition burning beneath her calm exterior, the hunger for power that had driven her to strike a deal with the very forces they had fought against. Kale shook his head, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "This isn't the way, Lyra. The relics aren't tools. They're a prison. Using them would only unleash the evil they're meant to contain. My family gave their lives to protect this world. I can't betray their sacrifice." Lyra's expression hardened, her patience wearing thin. "Your family's gone, Kale. Holding on to their memory won't bring them back, but this power could give us something better. Don't let sentiment blind you to what's possible." The tension between them crackled like a storm about to break. Kale's heart ached at the distance that had grown between them. The partnership they had once shared, now fractured beyond repair. But he knew there was no turning back. "I'm sorry, Lyra," he said, his voice firm. "I can't let you do this." Her eyes narrowed, and in an instant, the battle was joined. Lyra moved with the precision of a predator, her strikes swift and calculated. She wielded no weapon but her own cunning, her movements fluid and unpredictable. Kale, on the other hand, relied on the Relic's power, their energy surging through him as he countered her attacks. The amulet in his hand glowed brightly, its light cutting through the gathering darkness. But Lyra was relentless, her agility and resourcefulness keeping her one step ahead. She knew his every weakness, and she exploited them without hesitation. The fight raged on, the air filled with the clash of their wills. Kale's strength came in bursts, the Relic's power a double-edged sword that both sustained and drained him. Lyra, ever the opportunist, used his exhaustion to her advantage, her strikes growing more precise as the battle wore on, but Kale's resolve never wavered. Each time she pressed him, he pushed back, his determination fueled by the memory of his family and the weight of their sacrifice. Finally, the two stood locked in a tense standoff, their breaths ragged, their bodies battered. Neither could gain the upper hand, their strengths and weaknesses perfectly matched. Lyra stepped back, her expression a mix of frustration and grudging respect. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You can't stop me, Kale, not forever." With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, the figures following her like silent sentinels. Kale sank to his knees, the Relic's glow dimming as exhaustion overtook him. His body ached, his heart heavy with the loss of what had once been a trusted alliance. But even in his weariness, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lyra's betrayal had only strengthened his resolve. The Relics had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. The world depended on it, and so did the memory of his family. As he rose to his feet, the weight of his mission pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he knew there was no other choice. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The fortress loomed like a jagged scar against the horizon, its spires piercing the storm-heavy sky. This was no ordinary stronghold. It was the prison of the ancient evil, a place where the veil between worlds grew dangerously thin. Kale's journey had brought him to the edge of the known world, a desolate expanse where the air itself seemed to hum with unease. Yet he wasn't alone. As he pressed forward, a group of villagers and outcasts emerged from the shadows, their faces etched with determination. These were not warriors or heroes by trade, but ordinary people whose lives had been upended by the Relic's power. They had seen the chaos it unleashed, and in Kale, they saw a chance to set things right. Among them was a blacksmith named Lyra, her hands calloused from years of forging tools, but now gripping a hammer meant for battle. Beside her stood Finn, a former thief with a knack for navigating treacherous terrain, and Marin, a healer whose knowledge of ancient remedies proved invaluable. Their reasons for joining Kale varied. Some sought redemption, others revenge, but their shared belief in his mission united them. Together, they formed an unlikely fellowship, bound by a common purpose, and the hope that one man's resolve could tip the scales against an ancient darkness. The path to the fortress was anything but straightforward. The land itself seemed to resist their progress, the ground shifting unpredictably, and the skies unleashing storms that felt almost sentient. Worse still were the shadowy creatures that swarmed from every direction, their forms rippling like ink spilled across water. These were no mere beasts. They were manifestations of the ancient evil, drawn to the relic's power and the growing weakness of the barrier. Kale and his companions fought tirelessly, their makeshift weapons and sheer determination keeping the hordes at bay. But with every step, the relics in Kale's satchel pulsed more intensely, their glow a constant reminder of the stakes. As they neared the fortress, Kale began to hear it, a voice, low and insidious, threading its way into his thoughts. At first, it was faint, little more than a whisper. But soon, it grew louder, its tone both seductive and menacing. "You've suffered so much," it murmured, its words echoing in his mind. "All this loss, all this pain, but it doesn't have to be this way. With my power, you could bring them back, your family whole and alive. Imagine it, Kale. Imagine holding them again." The voice was persuasive, its promises weaving a tapestry of longing and regret. For a moment, Kale faltered, the weight of his grief threatening to overwhelm him. The temptation was undeniable. What wouldn't he give to see his family again? But then he remembered the cost. The relics weren't just a key to his past. They were a safeguard, a barrier holding back a force that could consume the world. To yield to the voice's promises would mean sacrificing everything his family had fought to protect. Clenching his fists, Kale pushed the thoughts aside, his resolve hardening. "I won't let you win," he muttered under his breath, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. The relic's glow dimmed slightly, as if acknowledging his determination, but the voice lingered, a constant reminder of the battle he faced, not just against the ancient evil, but against his own desires. The fortress was now within sight, its massive gates looming like the jaws of some great beast. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to keep them out. Kale turned to his companions, their faces a mix of fear and resolve. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared mission. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." The group nodded, their silence speaking volumes. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. As they approached the gates, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and the voice in Kale's mind grew louder, more insistent. "You think you can stop me?" it sneered, its tone dripping with malice. "You're just a boy, playing with forces you can't possibly understand, but I can show you true power. All you have to do is say yes." Kale took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the relics. The final confrontation was near, and with it, the ultimate test of his resolve. The ancient evil was no longer just a distant threat. It was a presence, a force that sought to break him from within. But Kale knew one thing for certain: he would not let it win. Not now, not ever. The fortress gates groaned open as Kale and his companions stepped into the shadowed courtyard, the air thick with an oppressive stillness that seemed to suffocate the very light. Above them, the sky churned with dark clouds, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from the fortress's presence. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of cloaks and the occasional clink of weapons. But it didn't last. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, Lyra at their forefront, her expression unreadable, her eyes cold and calculating. Behind her stood the shadowy figures, their forms shifting like smoke, their presence radiating menace. The servants of the ancient evil had been waiting. "You're too late, Kale," Lyra said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Her tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something dangerous. "You've been chasing shadows while I've been building an empire. The relics aren't meant to be destroyed, they are meant to be wielded. Together, we could reshape the world." Her words were persuasive, laced with a logic that was hard to ignore, but Kale could see the cracks in her facade. The ambition that had once driven her had twisted into something unrecognizable, something hollow. Kale took a step forward, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "This isn't you, Lyra. You're smarter than this. The relics aren't tools, they're a prison. Using them will only unleash the evil they're meant to contain. Can't you see that?" His plea hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope that Lyra seemed determined to sever. She shook her head, her expression hardening. "Sentimentality won't save the world, Kale. Power will, and if you won't join me, then you're just another obstacle in my way." With a sharp gesture from Lyra, the shadowy figures surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing as they descended on Kale and his allies. The battle erupted in a cacophony of steel and magic, the courtyard transformed into a chaotic whirlwind of motion. Kale's companions fought valiantly, their determination unwavering despite the overwhelming odds. Lyra's hammer struck with the force of a thunderclap, sending shadowy figures sprawling, while Finn's agility kept him one step ahead of his enemies. Marin moved among the wounded, her healing touch a beacon of hope amidst the chaos. They fought not just for themselves, but for the world, their courage a testament to the power of unity. Amidst the fray, Kale found himself face to face with Lyra. The clash between them was as much emotional as it was physical, their movements a dance of desperation and regret. Lyra fought with a precision born of years of survival, her strikes quick and calculated, her every move designed to exploit Kale's weaknesses. But Kale's strength lay not in his skill, but in his resolve. The relic's power surged through him, their energy a double-edged sword that both sustained and drained him. Each blow he landed was tempered by the weight of their shared history. The bond they had once forged now fractured beyond repair. "You're a fool, Kale," Lyra spat, her voice laced with venom as she dodged his strike, "sacrificing everything for a world that doesn't care about you." "What's the point?" Kale's response was swift, his voice cutting through the noise of battle. "The point is that I care about this world, about the people in it, about you." "But you've lost sight of that, Lyra. You've let the power consume you." His words struck a nerve, and for a moment, Lyra hesitated. But the moment passed, and her attacks grew more ferocious, her desperation palpable. The fight reached its climax in a burst of energy, the relic's power flaring as Kale delivered a final, decisive blow. Lyra crumpled to the ground, her body limp, but her eyes still blazing with defiance. Kale stood over her, his breath ragged, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had done. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. Lyra said nothing, her gaze locked on his as he turned away, leaving her behind as he pressed on toward the heart of the fortress. The path ahead was fraught with danger, the fortress's corridors twisting, and turning like a labyrinth, designed to confound and confuse. But Kale's resolve never wavered. The relic's glow flickered faintly in his satchel, their light a constant reminder of the stakes. The ancient evil was stirring, its presence growing stronger with every step he took. The battle with Lyra had been a test, a trial of his ability to resist the temptations of power. But the true challenge lay ahead, and Kale knew that the hardest choices were yet to come. The fate of the world rested on his shoulders, and he would not falter. Not now, not ever. The heart of the fortress was a cavernous chamber, its walls carved with ancient symbols that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, a weight that pressed down on Kale's chest with every breath. At the center of the room, suspended in a swirling vortex of shadow and light, was the source of it all, the ancient evil. Its form was indistinct, a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to defy comprehension, but its presence was undeniable. It radiated power, a force so immense that it made the relics in Kale's satchel hum with a restless energy. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the culmination of a journey that had tested him in ways he could never have imagined. The entity's voice echoed through the chamber, low and resonant, each word reverberating in Kale's mind. "You've come far, Kale," it said, its tone almost mocking. "But now you stand at a crossroads. The relics you carry are not just shackles, they are a key. Use them, and you could wield my power. Imagine what you could achieve. Wealth, glory, even the return of those you've lost. Your family, they could be with you again. All you have to do is say yes." The offer hung in the air, a tantalizing promise that tugged at the deepest corners of Kale's heart. The thought of seeing his family again, of holding them close, was almost too much to bear. For a moment, his resolve wavered, the weight of his grief threatening to overwhelm him. But then he remembered the faces of those who had stood by him, Alara, Finn, Marin, even Lyra before her fall. Their courage, their sacrifices, their belief in him. He thought of his parents, their unwavering love, and the lessons they had taught him. They hadn't given their lives so he could undo their sacrifice. They had done it to protect the world, to ensure that the ancient evil remained sealed away. The relics weren't just tools or keys. They were a responsibility, a burden he had sworn to bear. The entity's promises were empty, a mirage designed to exploit his deepest desires, and Kale knew, with a clarity that cut through the chaos, what he had to do. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the relics. The entity's voice grew louder, more insistent, its words laced with desperation. "You're making a mistake," it roared, its form writhing as if in pain. "You could have everything, why throw it all away?" But Kale didn't answer. His mind was made up. He closed his eyes, focusing on the relic's energy, their power surging through him as he began the ritual to destroy them. The chamber erupted in light, a blinding cascade that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality apart. The relics shattered, their fragments dissolving into the air as a wave of energy exploded outward. The ancient evil screamed, its form unraveling as the barrier sealed shut once more. The fortress trembled, the walls cracking as the energy surged through them, but Kale stood firm. He could feel the connection to his family fading, their spirits slipping away as the relics were destroyed. It was a pain, unlike anything he had ever known, a loss that cut deeper than any blade. But even as the tears streamed down his face, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had honored their sacrifice. He had done what they would have wanted. When the light finally faded, the chamber was silent. The relics were gone, their power spent, and the ancient evil was sealed away once more. Kale sank to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his heart was steady. The journey had cost him everything, but it had also given him something priceless, a sense of purpose, a legacy to carry forward. The world was safe, not because of power or ambition, but because of the choices he had made. And as he rose to his feet, his gaze fixed on the horizon, he knew that the fight wasn't over. There would always be darkness, but there would also be light. And as long as he drew breath, he would stand against the shadows, a beacon of hope in a world that needed it more than ever. The fortress groaned and shuddered, its ancient stones crumbling under the weight of its own decay. Dust filled the air, swirling in chaotic patterns as the walls began to collapse. Kale stumbled through the chaos, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. The relics were gone, their power spent, and the ancient evil sealed away once more. But the cost had been immense, and the fortress itself seemed determined to bury its secrets and anyone still inside. From the shadows, Lyra appeared, her hammer slung over her shoulder, her face streaked with soot and sweat. "This way," she shouted over the roar of falling debris, her voice cutting through the chaos. Kale followed without hesitation, his legs carrying him forward more out of sheer will than strength. Finn and Merrin were close behind, their movements sharp and purposeful, despite the exhaustion etched into their faces. Together, they navigated the crumbling corridors, their bond forged in the fires of battle, proving stronger than the fortress's collapsing walls. As they neared the exit, a faint cry stopped Kale in his tracks. It was Lyra. She lay slumped against a jagged piece of rubble, her breathing shallow, her face pale with pain. For a moment, Kale hesitated, the weight of their shared history pressing heavily on him. But then he moved, his instincts overriding the lingering sting of betrayal. He knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he lifted her from the ground. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Lyra's eyes flickered open, her gaze meeting his with a mix of surprise and something softer, something unspoken. The journey to safety was a blur of motion and sound, the fortress collapsing around them as they pushed forward. Kale's arms ached under Lyra's weight, but he didn't falter. The others cleared a path, their determination unwavering even as the ground shook beneath their feet. When they finally burst into the open air, the sky above was a stark contrast to the darkness they had left behind, clear and vast. The first hints of dawn painting the horizon in soft hues of gold and pink. The fortress, now little more than a heap of rubble, was swallowed by the earth, its secrets buried once and for all. Kale set Lyra down gently, his hands trembling as he checked her wounds. She winced but managed a faint smile, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to come back for me," she said, her tone tinged with regret. Kale met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "Yes, I did," he replied simply. There was no anger in his voice, no lingering resentment, only the quiet acknowledgement of all they had been through. In that moment, the rivalry that had driven them apart seemed to dissolve, replaced by a shared understanding of the sacrifices they had both made. As the sun rose, casting its light over the scarred landscape, Kale sat in silence, his thoughts a whirlwind of memories and emotions. The relics were gone, their power extinguished, but their legacy remained. He had lost so much: his family, his innocence, even a part of himself. Yet in the face of that loss, he had found something unexpected, a sense of purpose, a strength he hadn't known he possessed. The journey had changed him, shaping him into someone capable of bearing the weight of the world's hopes and fears. The scars of the relic's power would linger, a reminder of the choices he had made and the lives that had been touched or lost along the way. But as Kale looked out at the horizon, he felt a flicker of hope. The world was saved, not by power or ambition, but by the courage of those who had stood against the darkness. And though the road ahead would be long and uncertain, he knew he wouldn't walk it alone. The bonds he had forged, the lessons he had learned, would guide him forward. The journey had ended, but the story was far from over. The journey that had taken Kale to the farthest corners of the world finally brought him back to where it all began, Eldermere. The village greeted him with cheers and open arms, their voices rising in a chorus of gratitude and awe. To them, he was a hero, a beacon of hope, who had faced unimaginable dangers to protect their world. But as Kale stood amidst the celebration, he couldn't shake the weight of his own doubts. Hero, the word felt foreign, almost mocking. How could he be a hero when so much had been lost along the way? His family, his innocence, even the trust he had once placed in those closest to him. The scars of his journey ran deep, and no amount of praise could erase them. Yet, Kale didn't turn away from the village's admiration. Instead, he channeled it into action. Eldermere, like so many other places, bore the marks of the relic's power: crumbled homes, shattered lives, and a lingering sense of unease. Kale threw himself into the work of rebuilding, his hands calloused from labor, but his heart steady with purpose. He helped clear debris, repair homes, and tend to the wounded, his quiet determination inspiring others to join him. It wasn't just about restoring the village, it was about healing the wounds the relics had left behind, one act of kindness at a time. Lyra, ever the enigma, appeared one day at the edge of the village. Her presence was met with wary glances, but Kale welcomed her without hesitation. Her motives remained unclear, her past actions a shadow that lingered between them. Yet as she worked alongside him, her loyalty seemed genuine, her sharp wit and resourcefulness proving invaluable. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful apology, just the unspoken understanding that they were stronger together than apart. Whatever her reasons for staying, Kale chose to trust her, at least for now. The journey had taught him that people were rarely as simple as they seem. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kale made his way to the ruins of the forgotten temple. The place where it had all started now felt like a relic itself, its crumbling walls a testament to the passage of time and the weight of memory. He knelt before the altar, placing a small tribute, a single flower, a symbol of hope and remembrance. The air was still, almost reverent, as if the temple itself acknowledged his presence. For a moment, he allowed himself to grieve, the weight of his family's loss pressing heavily on his chest. But even in his sorrow, there was a sense of peace. He had honored their sacrifice. He had done what they would have wanted, As Kale turned to leave, something caught his eye, a faint glow in the distance, just beyond the temple's edge. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. His breath hitched, his mind racing with possibilities. The relics were gone, their power spent, but the glow was a reminder that some secrets refused to stay buried. Was it a sign, a warning, or simply the lingering echo of a journey that had changed him forever? Kale didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: the story wasn't over. He stood at the edge of the temple, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, the future unknown, but for the first time in a long time, Kale felt ready to face it. The relics had tested him, broken him, and ultimately shaped him into someone stronger than he had ever imagined. Whatever lay beyond the horizon, he would meet it with the same courage and determination that had carried him this far. The journey had ended, but the adventure was just beginning, and as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Kale took a deep breath, stepping forward into the unknown.
you.